all of East Asia, all the way here, all the islands in the Central Pacific, the South Pacific, and ultimately Australia and New Zealand.
Wow.
So they felt that all of this was going to be the area where their manifest destiny was taking us. Now, the original thing that held them back was the fact that this time Russia had a huge naval fleet stationed up here in Vladivostok, Russia. And in 1904, the Japanese attacked in their naval force in a surprise attack, crippled their navy, and then they waged a war for the next year and a half, and Russia sued for peace. That was the Japanese-Russo War of 1904 and 1905. So at that point in 1905, the Soviet threat to Japanese expansion was gone. In 1911, they took control of Korea and ran it as a puppet state. They appointed a Korean to be the head of the country, but they told him everything to do. So it was essentially Japan was controlling Korea from 1911 on. Now, for the next 20 to 30 years, in the Japanese, they became more militaristic, more imperialistic, more nationalistic, and everyone in the country, from politicians to the people in general, felt it's our destiny to move down. We are superior to the other people in these areas, and so we should be, they should be under our orbit. So during that time, they built a very large army of more than 5 million men in a country of 75 million. That was pretty significant. And then by 1930s, they were ready to start implementing their plan. So in 1936, they took control of Manchuria. And then later that year, they took control of Outer Mongolia. So, and then in 1937, they attacked Japan. And the war between Japan and China lasted for, right up until 1945, when World War II ended and Japan dropped out of the war. The Chinese were able to stalemate the Japanese pretty much in China because they had a lot of help from U.S. supplies that were flown from India over what they called the hump, the island or the mountains, and they would send supplies in there. This is the time in 37 and 38 where a retired Army general by the name of Claire Chennault, who was born in Commerce, formed the famous Flying Tigers, and they fought against the Japanese who were trying to take control of the whole country. And then in 1940, the Japanese took control of all of French Indochina, which meant Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand all came under their orbit. So here they were. By 1940, they had Manchuria, Outer Mongolia. They were trying to take control of China, and they had control of French Indochina. And in 1940, they did something that was very important to them. They signed it was called the Tripartite Treaty, which was a treaty between Japan, Germany, and Italy that said an attack upon one of those nations would be considered an attack on all of them, and that the three would then bind together to fight whoever their enemy was. So that brings us up to 1940. Was the United States Congress, were the American people concerned about this? All this rapid expansion of the Japanese in the Pacific? No, because in the 1920s, the Americans came to believe that the entrance of the United States into World War I had been a major mistake, because a lot of studies showed out that the bankers and a lot of industries really made a lot of money on that war. And so they called them the merchants of death. And historians have revealed this, and magazine articles talked about this. So the Americans said, the public said, we made that mistake now, we should never make it again. So in the 1930s, the Congress passed a series of laws that were called the Neutrality Acts. And they were designed to make sure that the United States was never drawn into another war again. And so there was one person that was very concerned about this, and this was President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And there were a handful of people in the State Department and maybe 10 or 12 congressmen out of nearly 450 that were concerned about this expansion. And
so, Dr. McFarland, sir,
yes,
that's why Claire Snow had such difficulty getting planes then. You're answering that for me. To send to China in the late 30s.
What was the remark?
Claire Chanel, that's why he had great difficulty getting planes to send to China from Congress.
That's right, yes, yeah. Because by this time, really up until 1941, Congress began to kind of let things go. So,
Sorry. There you go.
okay, all right. So that's where we were by 1940. In 41, by this time, the Japanese were making clear that they wanted to get these areas down here, Sumatra, Borneo, down in Indonesia, because of the oil reserves and the rubber plantations that were there. So they had their eyes on this next. And Roosevelt wanted to stop that, halt that expansion. And so in 1940, he did two things that were important. First of all, he moved the American naval fleet from San Diego, California, to the Hawaiian Islands, to Pearl Harbor in the island of Oahu. And that was one thing. The Japanese didn't like that because here was the United States moving their warships there. They said, might they try and halt us? The other thing he did, and this really bothered the Japanese, with a lot of arm twisting, Roosevelt convinced Congress in 1940 to pass a legislation that would greatly expand the United States Navy. In fact, if the plan was carried out, by 1948, it was planned that the United States would have the largest navy in the world. And that really concerned Japan, because they said, boy, each year that passes, the United States is going to be gaining on us on their naval power in this area. So by 1941, the United States had taken some steps that really bothered Japan. And to understand the attack of Pearl Harbor, you need to understand that in the 1930s, the Navy had, or the Japanese had, one large fleet of about 50 ships, including a half a dozen aircraft carriers, we had battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and this fleet would move in tandem down here, kind of to intimidate those areas. And this was of concern to the United States. But it was such a large fleet that we knew where the fleet was. Because, for example, if it was up here in Hong Kong, then we knew where it was. And then if they sailed down to Singapore, then we would know where it was. But in addition to that big fleet, the Japanese had about 50 other warships that acted as lone wolves. There maybe be an aircraft carrier with a couple of destroyers on. Most of these flotillas were anywhere from 3 to 5 ships, and they just operated all through this area gathering information, and this was of concern. Now, in 1941, by the fall of 1941, we were concerned that the Japanese were going to attack our bases in the Philippine Islands, or we thought they may attack Hong Kong or Singapore, or maybe Port Moresby, which was a big British naval base here in New Guinea. And so, to discourage that, Roosevelt did several things in the fall of 1941. The first thing he did was he seized all Japanese assets in the United States, which this meant that there were tens of millions of dollars that the Japanese could not use to buy things from the world market. The other thing he did, he prohibited the sale of any petroleum products or any steel. Now that was really devastating to the Japanese because they were planning on greatly increasing the size of their naval forces. And if you can't get steel to build warships, that's going to hold you back. And they didn't have control of these petroleum areas yet. They had been getting most of their oil from the United States. And so when that was cut off, you're not going to be able to keep your ships afloat and your airplanes in the air. So at that point, they decided to follow a plan that had been developed by a famous admiral by the name of Yamamoto, who had been educated at Harvard and served a lot of time in the Japanese embassy at Washington, and did many of the top Japanese military leaders and a lot of their diplomatic work and trained at American universities. And Yamamoto looked at how successful his country had been in 1904 when they attacked the Russian fleet at Vladivostok. And so he came to the conclusion that if we want to stop America, we need to attack them and destroy the American naval fleet at Hawaii, and we need to do it when we're at peace with them. That's the key. You've got to be at peace, because if you're at peace with them, they're not going to be expecting an attack. And so that was one reason that there was so much surprise over the attack at Pearl Harbor, because we were at peace with them. In fact, there were some diplomatic representatives in Washington. They'd gotten there at the end of November, and they were negotiating to try and convince the United States that we should let them expand into these areas down here and fulfill their manifest destiny. But now, once they knew that the steel and oil was going to be cut off, they felt that they had to do something, or that their whole attempt to spread throughout the Pacific would be stalled. So they began in late October, after the actions by Roosevelt, to call all of these ships in that had been here throughout this area, and they told them to come up to the Kuril Islands in northern Japan. It's very isolated, very few people live up there. There's very little merchant traffic in the North Pacific, and so by the middle of November, the Japanese had assembled another large fleet made up of 6 aircraft carriers and other warships, giving them a flotilla of about 50 ships. And on November 26th, they set sail first heading east and then going down and starting to come down. Now all 50 ships maintained radio silence. So American merchant ships, even if they were in the area, they could not pick up any of the communications of these ships. So they went undetected from November 26th to December 6th. By December 6th in the evening, they were just 250 miles off of the coast of Oahu. Now, let me see if I can use my.
I got it.
Oh, there you
Next
are.
one, yeah, there we go.
Okay, all right. Here is the island of Oahu. Down here we have Pearl Harbor, over here we have Honolulu. The Japanese planned to have 3 waves of attack. Each one was about 180 planes. And the first one was to come down, go to the western side of Oahu, and come around and hit the fleet at Pearl Harbor. They also wanted to hit Wheeler Field, which was our second largest air base in the Pacific at that time. And then the plan was that attack would last about an hour, and then just as it was ending and those planes were going back to the carriers, those 180 planes, the second wave of 180 would come down, hit a naval air station here, a naval field, and then come down and do mop-up actions at Pearl Harbor. They also planned a third attack that would come down to Pearl Harbor, and okay, here's Pearl Harbor. The key in Pearl Harbor is Ford Island, right in the middle here, because this is the island around which all of the American warships would berth whenever they came in. And this area right here is where all the battleships were located, but there were facilities all around Ford Island, and down in this area is where the aircraft carriers, we had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific in 1941, and the Japanese goal was to take out those 3 aircraft carriers and take out as many of these warships. These were our battleships, which was the supreme source of naval strength in that time, to take those out. Now, here's Ford Island. There had a small airfield on it, and they had ships all around the area. This is what they call Battleship Row. And it was largely in this area where they expected the aircraft carriers. Now, the procedure of these ships was on whether it was aircraft carriers, they're not shown here because they were not there at the time, and the battleships would all go out on Monday morning for a week of training out in the ocean. And they would go out, and then on Friday afternoon, they would all come back and go to port, and then they would give the sailors or the Marines, whoever were on there, they would give them the weekend off. And those sailors had to have a good time in Honolulu and those weekends. So, whenever the first Japanese planes came down, the first thing they were surprised to see is that the aircraft carriers were not there. And the reason they were not there is they had gone out on Monday morning, they were doing their training, and each of the commanders on the aircraft carriers were not pleased with the performance of their sailors. So they said, we're not going to return to Pearl Harbor this week. We're going to stay out here and train our sailors. And so that was very fortuitous for the United States, because those 3 aircraft carriers survived and played a major role in the Battle of Midway, which took place a little more than 6 months later. So that was key. Now, let's see. This is a ship. This is an interesting picture that we received from one of the Japanese pilots after World War II, because he snapped this just at the time when the attack was starting. Probably this plane, which had dropped a bomb, they had bombers that just had either 1 or 2 bombs on their wings, and then they had torpedo bombers that would come in low, drop a torpedo somewhere here, and then hopefully it would go and hit one of the battleships. But here, one of the bombers had dropped a bomb and it exploded. But what's interesting about this picture, you can see how the battleships were all lined up there, and they were able to have it. Here, the biggest attack and the most notable was the one on the Arizona. I don't know, maybe some of you have been at that memorial in Hawaii. The Arizona was hit. The bomb went through the deck down into its magazines where they stored all of their ordnance, and it set off a gigantic explosion that killed more than 1,000 sailors just in that one instant. The Arizona was actually here. This goes right along here. This is the Arizona. That was one that was sunk. Here is the West Virginia. That was one that was sunk. Out here on the outside was Oklahoma that was sunk. And then here is the USS California. All 4 of those destroyers were sunk. Now, here are some scenes. I'm just going to run through them quickly. This was the Arizona shortly after it hit and it exploded. This was a destroyer that had been in dry dock at Pearl Harbor. They just pulled it in there the week before, and they hadn't unloaded the explosives yet. And when a bomb hit the USS Shaw, this was the result. There's where there were some individuals trying to see if they could save anyone on the Arizona. Here's a picture taken at Hickam Field, which is right adjacent to when the Shaw exploded, and some of the airplanes had already been damaged. And this was at Wheeler Field up in central Oahu when it was hit, and there's some of the damage, resultant damage of the Japanese attack. Here's another scene of Hickam Field right when things were burning. In this area had been the hangars where most of the aircraft were held, and this was the damage at Wheeler. Now the casualties were terrific. More than 2,400 American servicemen lost their lives in this attack that lasted just under 2 hours. The 2,400, 1,077 were from the Arizona, and the others were from the warships that were hit. There were 4 battleships were sunk, and 9 other warships were badly damaged. We lost 188 aircraft between the attack on Wheeler and Hickam. And we had 159 aircraft badly damaged. So that basically, they took out all the air power we had in the Pacific at that time. Again, in less than 2 hours. And the Japanese had lost a few planes. They lost 129 airmen. But this was very bad for the United States. but there was two reasons it was not as bad as it could have been. One, I just mentioned, the aircraft carriers were not there, so they were unscathed. The other thing is Pearl Harbor is a very shallow harbor. Water depth is only about 40 to 60 feet. So when the Arizona was, quote, sunk, it just went down about 40 feet and then rested on the bottom of the port. Same with the West Virginia, the Oklahoma, and the California. So they were able to bring 3 of those ships. They weren't able to salvage the Arizona, but the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California were all refloated within the next 2 years and saw active duty during World War II. So as a result of these 2,400 casualties, President Roosevelt, as you indicated, gave a speech on December 8th, calling it the Day of Infamy. And that afternoon, he asked Congress to declare war. Because, you remember from your civics lesson, only Congress can declare a war. That afternoon, by a vote of 82 to 0 in the Senate and 388 to 1 in the House, we voted to go to war against Japan. Now, the tripartite treaty kicks in, and 4 days later, Germany and Italy, according to the treaty, they would go to war against the United States. So on the 12th of December, they declared war on the United States. And that very afternoon, the United States, by a vote of, a unanimous vote in both the House and the Senate, declared war upon Germany. The one person that didn't vote for it was a congresswoman from, I'm not sure if it was Wyoming or Montana, somewhere out there. Her name was Jeanette Rankin, and she was a pacifist, so she didn't vote for war against Japan. But a few days later, when we were attacked, she said, okay, they've attacked us, now I'll vote for to go to war. So at this point, Americans were just completely shocked. How could this happen? That we didn't know this. Where was the failure in intelligence? So Congress started in the middle of December of 41, appointing an official board of inquiry to determine who was at fault for this. Well, between 1941 and 1994, we had 9 congressional examinations of who was responsible for the failure, our failure at Pearl Harbor. And each of those ended up asking a lot more questions than they gave answers, and they could never really come up. In the aftermath of that, the commander of the naval forces on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Husband Kimmel, was relieved, as was the commander of the Army forces, General Walter Short. But it was felt that they were pretty much scapegoats. And in 1999, the Senate passed a resolution claiming or exonerating those 2 commanders, although they had been long since passed away. So the best way you can explain the attack was that we didn't know about the Second Fleet. Now, a lot of conspiracy theories developed in the next 30 to 40 years even. And most of them were aimed at President Roosevelt, and they claimed that he wanted to get us in the war against Germany, and he felt the easiest way to do it was to put clear targets, the ships at Hawaii and the aircraft. Conspiracists pointed out that all of the aircraft, Hickam and Wheeler Field, were all out together close to the middle of the field. Now, the conspiracists said we did that so we would make such a tempting target for them. But military commanders explained that they had done that because what they were worried about on Hawaii was sabotage, because there were a lot of Japanese people living in the Hawaiian Islands. So they moved in there so that they could better patrol the area around those planes. Now, the leading scholar on the whole matter of Pearl Harbor is a man by the name of Gordon Prange, who was a professor at the University of Maryland, who spoke Japanese, was fluent in it, and after World War II, he was General MacArthur's historian in Tokyo, and he interviewed hundreds of people, anyone that had anything to do in Japan with the attack on Pearl Harbor. And then when he returned to the United States in the 1950s and returned to the University of Maryland, he interviewed the commanders that had survived in that. And he felt that there was no conspiracy. That was his conclusion. But he did give credit to the Japanese. He said they had a very sophisticated plan. They executed it well, and that we should really give them credit for pulling this off. And he said the errors that were made by different commanders in the field were basically errors of omission rather than commission, because we just didn't expect Pearl Harbor, which was 4,000 miles from Tokyo, we just didn't anticipate that they would be able to come that far and be undetected and attack us. So that's why it came as such a shock. We were at peace, and they did it. So that's a quick overview of what happened to the United States and how we got so off guard. The one thing that it did do was the attack on Pearl Harbor immediately ended American isolationism. And on the Monday morning, the recruiting centers across the country were besieged by the young men who wanted to get into the military to fight the Japanese. A lot of those people were disappointed because America had developed its war plans and it called for a Germany first policy. So it was our idea that we had to defeat Germany in Europe, and then just after that we would be able to attack Japan. But a lot of hatred of the Japanese because of what they did on Pearl Harbor. So that's.
There was a significance in the date, wasn't there? Was there a significance in the date?
Significance in the attack?
Right.
Yeah, the big significance was the United States responded by declaring war on Japan, and that kicked in the tripartite treaty, and then it led us within 4 days, or 5 days of the speech, to declare it. So the end of isolationism in America and the declaration of war against Japan, which brought in the tripartite treaty and brought us into war against what we call the Axis powers.
Dr. McFarland, those 3 aircraft carriers not being in port, I've never known that. I guess everybody else here knew that, but that's kind of suspicious that they weren't there. I mean, that was a fluke.
Yeah, it was. The commanders all claimed that it was. Now, whether that was it. Now, a lot of warnings had been sent out. Let me see here. And the conspiracy theory pointed out the fact that we sent messages to be on high alert in this first week of December, because the fleet was down here at Singapore and they started north. And the concern was, where were they going to hit? The United States was afraid they were going to hit Clark Field, which was our big field, airfield in the Philippine Islands. We had a number of Army personnel there. The British were afraid that they might be headed towards Hong Kong. So we were concerned about the Philippine Islands. So we sent out messages to all the bases in the Pacific, including the Hawaiian Islands, Midway Island that we had, Wake Island that we had, the Philippines. And people said, well, they should have really been alert on Pearl Harbor. But those were sent out just routinely to the different commands. People said, hey, Japan's 4,000 miles away. I mean, they knew it was quite a jaunt from San Diego to about 2,400 miles there. They said, there's no way they could come 4,000 miles and launch an attack against us. So they took it somewhat seriously, but not that seriously.
Thank you.
Okay.